worked at, welcome, have a seat. Previously working at Visa, at Airtel Money, at M-Pesa. P2P payments have come a long way, but there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still fragmentation in the market, and there's still a lot of gaps in the interoperability solutions that exist. So I'd like to welcome the panelists to tell us a bit about themselves and comment on the status of fragmentation and interoperability in P2P payments, and then we go further into the details of the discussion.
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. My name is Shomowe. Nice to see very familiar faces. I currently work with Citibank, taking care of the domestic payments across EMEA. I was previously working with IPSL, home of Pesalink. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Hi, everybody. My name is Sharon Karuga Kinyanjui. I'm currently the principal consultant at Diaspora Bridges Advisory, or DBA for short. So at DBA, we are focused on advising companies, so predominantly startups and growth-focused companies across the continent in terms of payments, and helping them in terms of implementation. Prior to that, I've spent 15 years in the industry, 10 at Western Union, managing UK, Ireland, and the Nordics, and then the last 5 years with World Remit as the regional director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Thank you.
Hello. Hi everyone. My name is Sandeep Chaggar, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Peach Payments. Peach Payments is a digital payment company that has presence in South Africa, Kenya, and Mauritius. We power payments for some of the leading organizations across Africa, mainly in the markets that we are operating in. I've been working in the fintech space for the last 15 years, mainly in the regulated fintech space, starting with stock exchanges to banks, and now to one of the upcoming payment companies in Africa. So yes, thank you.
Good morning. My name is George. Glad to see you all. I work for Integrated Payment Services Limited. I think we are better known for our brand Pesalink. I lead the technology and operations team. And before that, I worked with Cellulant, Pan-African Financial Services Organization, as their Chief Technology Officer. I'm glad to be here.
So welcome. I'll start with you, George. In your world of payments, what is fragmentation? What's interoperability? What's P2P? Just, make it easy for all of us.
I'll define them quickly. So I think P2P is where you just are able to send money directly to somebody without necessarily going through an intermediary. And it's a little nuanced because even though we call it P2P, sometimes the P is an M because you're doing it to a merchant. Sometimes the P is a G because you're doing it to government. And sometimes the P is actually a B because you're sending it to another business. For example, like when you're paying an insurance premium. So that essentially is P2P, that I can simply pick up my app or technology of choice, be able to get the name of the person I'm paying, and then be able to send the payment in the simplest form possible. So underneath the engine, there are a lot of ways you're able to make that a reality. But when you talk about, I think, fragmentation is the fact that when you look at financial services, it's a stratified field where there are people who only have access to mobile money. There are others who are banked, so they have a bank account. There are others who have cards. So if you're trying to do a P2P via card, they can receive it or they can be able to make the payment. And other forms of payment. So the whole thing of fragmentation is the fact that there's no ubiquitous way to be able to send money to anybody. Then other than that, there are applications that have created their own ecosystem to be able to make person-to-person payments, whether it is cross-border, like we've seen with companies such as AfriX or DusuPay, And there are others that have just created their own ecosystem based on a card system. Like if you think about PayPal, anyone in PayPal can pay somebody else in PayPal, but it's all tied to a store of value that most of the times is a credit card. Yeah.
Good examples there on the different accounts that exist as sources of funds. Now moving to you, Sandeep, as just listening to George and the different variations of what a P2P will look like, will you consider P2P a painkiller, like a need to have, or is it a vitamin where, it's a nice to have?
Initially, it will definitely start as a vitamin and evolve into become a painkiller, because there's a massive problem or challenge that interoperability in PSPs is solving for, right? If we look at from a consumer perspective, what does a consumer want? If a consumer is using a particular app for payment, to transfer money from one person to the other, what does interoperability mean? A, the consumer should be able to connect any bank to that particular PSP provider, right? That's interoperability. If I'm on equity, I should be able to link my equity bank. If I'm on Stanbic, I should be able to link my Stanbic account, and then I should be able to transfer money to another consumer who may have an account with any particular bank or fintech. That's interoperability from a consumer perspective, right? I mean, second thing is we look at from an organization perspective, right? If I have to accept payments from consumers, what do I want, right? I want to accept payments from consumers who are using any financial institution, right? And single access is what is interoperability. Today, I'm seeing in most of the markets, if you go to a merchant, they're sitting with 5 or 6 QR codes, right? And depending on who is the provider, you scan that particular QR code, which is a hassle for that particular organization or merchant to do the reconciliation in the back end, right? I mean, and that's something that the Kenyan government or the central bank is working towards, is a standardized QR, one QR, and you can link any particular fintech in the back end to accept payments, right? So definitely, I mean, it'll start as a vitamin, evolve into a painkiller, and definitely solve a lot of problem for the consumer as well as for the end organization, and make a lot of the processes seamless, and overcome a lot of the challenges that especially the organizations are facing. That's where the fragmentation lies with the merchant, with the organization that is accepting payments. With the wide variety of options that they have, 5 POS machines, 5 QR codes, and at the back end you have a team that is always doing reconciliations. So yeah, that's my take on it.
And just to build on that, I'll turn to you, Sharon. They've talked about accounts that exist and the different elements that are sold for. But there's a group of customers that are still not reached by banks, by mobile money providers, by fintechs. There's an underserved population that could benefit from a solution on P2P. Could you just touch a little bit more on that, the segment and what the solutions could look like?
Sure. So one of the segments that's very near and dear to my heart and quite pertinent, because it was actually World Refugee Day about 2 days ago, is around refugees or displaced persons, right? Mm-hmm. So the UNHCR basically considers there are about over 103 million displaced persons globally, of which about 44 million come from sub-Saharan Africa. So they're a sizable proportion, and of course these are the people who are recognized or have been identified. Now, the biggest challenge that displaced people face is that they don't have a digital identity, right? And that's always the beginning part, right? To be able to get onto these platforms, to be able to sign on for M-Pesa, to be able to sign on for a bank, even the simplest thing, even collecting cash over the counter, you need some form of identity. So if you think about displaced persons, they often don't have that. So they're automatically excluded. Yet, in many instances, you'd be surprised to know that they have regular forms of income. And there are ways to actually assess how much money that they get. I think back to a time, a couple of years ago, I was doing some work at a displaced persons camp or refugee camp in Rwanda in an area called Giembe. And in Giembe, it's this camp which basically takes on a lot of people from the DRC, and all the infighting, and they basically relocated there. People have to walk 8 kilometers to get to their nearest bank location to collect, to pick up money that people have sent from abroad, to support them. And of course, when they go on that long walking trail, everybody knows that they're going to be collecting cash. So they're already at risk. So part of the project was trying to bring mobile payment services into the camp and see how we could get these people registered, right? So that it would be easier for them to be receiving money directly into their mobile phones. And even that exercise was, it was both rewarding, but it was also difficult in terms of raising awareness. But for me, I think when I think about people who are underserved segments, that's definitely one of the segments that I believe we could do more. And I think, people would be surprised to learn that they have very regular payments into those mobile wallets. Even more regular than maybe half the audience who might have Fuliza, right? Because these guys, without fail, they would be getting $600, $700 from their relatives out in, North America with regularity. So then if those people, if we are then able to build a whole system based on that and give them credit ratings, these are people who could own a border bike. There's so much possibilities based on data. Right? But yeah, I feel it's a very underserved segment, and there's a lot more that we could do.
Is there any other underserved segment?
Yes, I would say definitely the second segment I would say is underserved, and I think some of my panelists kind of alluded to it, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, is it's not quite P2P, but it's the B2B segment, right? If you think about this year alone, the global value of B2B payments is almost $39.3 trillion. Wow. Right? So if you think about that, and of course there have been a lot of discussions, I'm sure, which we'll touch on upon, about Africa and what's happening around payments in Africa, and how much is not been touched, which I think is in the segment of $292 billion. That for me is underserved. You can count the number of providers who players who consolidate B2B payments literally in a couple of hands. So I really think that's an underserved segment. Yeah.
And just to build on that, so he talked about the different accounts and the different money movements. He talked about P2P being a vitamin and slowly transitioning into a painkiller because customers are becoming more sophisticated. They want more convenience, they want more simplicity, they don't want to have 5 point of sale systems at the point of selling. You talked about the refugees, the internally displaced people, huge numbers, 44 million of them in Africa, and also the B2B opportunity. So just turning to you, Sean, as you look at payments across Europe, Middle East, and Africa, what are some of the lessons we could learn from a fragmentation, interoperability, and peer-to-peer payments we could learn from Europe or Middle East, or what are some of the lessons they could learn from us from Africa?
Okay, thank you very much. I think if we look at it from these different regions, I think Africa is very way ahead in terms of payment innovations. When you look at it very well, critically, if you look at the number of mobile wallets we have across the world, Africa is leading on that. If you look at a lot of instant payments being implemented, Africa is 6th, even ahead of US. I think UK is 2nd. So if you look at a lot of innovations that have actually gone into payment, even in chip and pin implementation and all that, Africa is actually taking a lead. But if you look at in terms of fragmentation and interoperability, given the credence to to Europe countries, they are taking the lead in terms of having a very highly regulated environment. When I'm sure all of us today we're talking about open banking, taking lead from what PSD2 has done, because there's always a reference to PSD2. We've seen a lot of cross-border implementation. When we are looking at SEPA, we are looking at Target 2 and all that. So there are a lot of highly regulated implementations, initiatives that are going on across Middle East and Europe. Middle East also taking a bit more from what Africa is actually implementing in terms of democratizing payment data, payment initiatives and all that. But in terms of having a very well coordinated and non-fragmented payment ecosystem, I think I give that to Europe countries because of EU regulations and all that. And I think if you look at what Afrexim is also trying to do, and African Union is also trying to do from AFTA and PAPS and all that, I think that is where they are now trying to come from. So for us to now foster that interoperability across Africa, we actually need to actually take a look at what are the harmonization of different frameworks, different policies, guidelines, standard operating procedures that need to get into place. So let's take a use case is East Africa, for instance. In East Africa country, they've actually been talking about regional payment system for the past, I think, 5 or 6, 7 years. But if you look at the fragmented implementations and framework that exists in each of the East African country, it will find it to be very difficult to actually have those kind of interoperable payment system that can actually be rolled out for I, as a person, to actually send money freely to George across different, country at a very low cost. I think cost is very important because we could see a lot of partners today are actually implementing it, but at what cost and at what rate. So those are some of the lessons that we can actually take a look at. And for Africa to also leapfrog around having a kind of harmonized payment ecosystem and reducing friction, I think regulation actually needs to drive, not to stifle innovation, but actually to drive that innovation and to ensure that we have it into place. A case in point, I think sometime early this year or late last year, Nigeria released the open banking guideline. And a lot of countries are actually following suit and all that, taking from what PSD2 has actually delivered in Europe. So those are some of the initiatives we actually need to have some sort of cross-country knowledge sharing for what has been implemented so far.
Just on the comment you mentioned about regulation, not stifling or encouraging. So from a East Africa perspective, we know some of the innovations, for instance, M-Pesa, it had to be the service provider convincing the regulator that this is good for the people by understanding the pain-killing aspect of it. I wonder whether stuff like open banking, for example, which is quite huge and advanced and regulator-driven in the European markets, whether our regulator here will be interested, for example, our regulators in Africa will be interested in pushing further open banking when they think already with the solutions we have are good enough.
Okay, so we are now transitioning to banking 4.0 now, from 1 to 2 to 3, transitioning to 4.0. And if you see all the attributes and components of banking 4.0, you actually see a lot of payment service providers are now implementing consumer-centric solutions. So all the product, services, solutions now evolves around customers. So it might actually be a person, a business, a merchant, and all that. So definitely, consumer decision actually takes precedence over the business decisions. So that is why open banking, I mean, it's a no-brainer. It will actually come into fruition. But how do we manage customer or consumers, data? I think it's very, very important. And because of the legal implication, that is why data protection laws, payment service directive, and all that actually needs to come into play. And that is why they actually falls under the purview of the regulator to actually oversee.
Good point there on the consumer data protection and regulator role. So just building on that and turning back to you, when we look at, George, when you look at PesaLink and the progress you've been able to make in terms of enabling P2P payments, whether it's business to business, customer to customer, bank, mobile money, how is the customer protected? And what is that unmet need that is yet to be addressed from an interoperability perspective?
Thank you. Yeah, so from a PesaLink perspective, I think what we are working hard at is to try and include everybody. And what we've seen in the recent past is that a lot of our partners are making more efforts to reach the unbanked and make it very easy for you to be able to have a bank account in this country. And also the fact that just letting and educating the customer in terms of what they are able to get with our service as well as what are the protections they get. So for example, what happens if I send money to the wrong account? What if I send it's the correct amount, but I sent it twice? So all these things around dispute resolution, I think is something that we've spent a lot of time and effort in. So what we've done is just introduce scheme rules that sort of like define how everybody plays within the ecosystem, so that when something goes wrong, and it's not just with PesaLink, I think it's something that's common with any financial system. Even when you look at card systems, MasterCard and Visa have their own set of dispute resolution rules and scheme rules. In terms of where the unserved need is, I think there's a lot of space for what I would say sophistication in terms of what the payments can do. And sophistication means, you know, there are still things that are extremely, extremely difficult to do in a financial system.
Like?
Some of them are, for example, if you need to send money across the borders, if you want to send it to Uganda or Tanzania or South Africa, there is no easy way of doing that. What always happens is you first convert it to dollars, then you send it, then the receiving back receives it in an international currency, then changes it back to a local currency, and there are all these losses every step of the way. So one of the things we are seeing is that the regional switches that have been set up, such as PAPS and COMESA have one that they're coming up with, they're trying to figure out how do we interconnect so that we allow cross-border payments to be easier, to have less friction. Then I think the other thing that's happening is just a lot of consumer education so that they can understand these are the capabilities that are available to you, that you can be able to take advantage of to make, in our case, real-time payments, be it payments for school fees, for rent, for insurance premiums, etc., etc. Being a brand that is associated with banks, sometimes it's hard to convince somebody that, you know, you're going to get this money instantly. They still have this mindset, if it's a bank, it's T+1, which means I send it today, maybe it will get there tomorrow, but definitely by the second or third day it will be there. But what we are seeing is a lot of people understanding what the service can be able to do and using it for a variety of use cases. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. And just turning to you, Sandeep, in terms of what you just commented on, can you touch on collaboration as one of the solutions? How do you collaborate to simplify complicated payment processes that exist right now? In terms of, you know, just the user experience, like you talked about the sending money cross-border and how it can get complicated for the customer. But also, in addition to that, earlier on, one of the speakers was talking about KYC. So how does, you know, the collaboration from a KYC perspective and simplification of services help in making P2P work for our target customers?
Thanks, Topi. You know, one of the key examples that I've been watching in the last couple of years is, taking the example of what India, the National Payments Corporation of India, has been doing, right? So they have their own switch, right? The instant payment and instant settlement switch called the Unified Payment Interface. And I've been following that the Unified Payment Interface has integrated with the instant payment switch in 13 countries. That includes Singapore, that includes Malaysia, that includes the Emirates, that includes a couple of other countries in the Middle East. There's an integration happening with Mauritius. So that's level one in terms of, you know, central bank to central bank, tie-up, collaboration or integration, right? Where instant payments can happen between countries. So these are more like bilateral sort of arrangements or collaborations between countries that facilitate instant payments between two countries. It is interesting to note that now the India QR code, that is the UPI QR code, is going live in these countries and vice versa, so that, you know, even when somebody is traveling, they can use their own QR code. And in Singapore, what I understand is it is interoperable. So that means even a user from an Indian PSP can go and do a transaction in Singapore in the QR code, you know, which is from the fintechs that are operating in the Singaporean market. Now, of course, the example of PAPS. Now, this is multiple countries coming together and creating an ecosystem, a collaborative ecosystem, so that instant transfers can happen between countries. Of course, what is it removes the dependence on networks like SWIFT, and nothing has to be converted to a US dollar, where it can just be conversion between two currencies, right? Dynamic conversion between two currencies can take place with certain, with networks of this sort. The other aspect, we were listening to the presentation earlier this morning on KYC. Now, if you go to a bank, you get the KYC done, and you've submitted a bulk of documents, and any other feature that you want with the bank, again, you submit the same set of documents. We've seen this. This is again an example of interoperability. If you look at what happened in the telecom sector, right? In most of the countries, if you have a SIM card from a particular provider, you can keep the same number and switch to the SIM card of another provider, but your number remains the same, right? So that's like a central database of information that exists. You're just switching the provider. In a similar manner, a lot of some of the countries are adopting. I know Mauritius is working on something called as a central KYC. India worked on something called as an Aadhaar card, right, which is again a form of a central KYC. So all your information is centralized in a repository managed by the government. You just need to give your number, you go and open your bank account with that number. All your KYC information is sitting, validated in the central repository. So you don't have, the consumer or the business does not have to go through the hassle of doing it again and again, providing the same set of documents to multiple institutions, right? How much of time is wasted in that admin task by organizations and by individuals. So definitely there are models that exist across the world of eKYC and central KYC and central verification process, where all your data, all your information is stored there, right? So the entire audit trail of your activity and tasks that you've done with financial institutions is maintained in that central repository. So definitely a lot of innovation is happening, a lot of collaboration is happening, and this will make it easy for a lot of the operators and individuals and businesses to do their daily jobs, right? Through collaboration and ease of use.
So clearly, collaboration is one of the big way forward in terms of simplifying. Is there anything else in terms of trends, what the future looks like for P2P payments?
Yeah, personally, I'm very, very excited by PAPS and what is happening, and tying it into what you're saying in terms of collaboration. I think it was just this week alone that they have signed an MOU with 5, Pan-African banks. So that actually means execution will be sooner rather than later, which means that B2B will become more of a reality on the continent, so that it'll be easy, to be able to send money across borders without all the complications.
Friction.
And the friction that our panelists have also talked about. And the most exciting part for me is the local currency, right? Most countries on the continent have been having the various challenges with the dollar. So I think it's an interesting space, and that's what I'm really looking forward to.
Anything to add, Sean?
Yeah, I think
I just want to.
I just want to take on what the previous speaker spoke about around central KYC and digital KYC. I think that's the future to go. It's been predicted that in the next couple of years, you will no longer be using your 4-digit PIN. You will just be using your thumb and all that, maybe iris and all that to authenticate transactions and all that. And if you look at what has also happened in a case of Nigeria using BVN, which has actually created a kind of centralized, unique identifier across all your bank accounts. It has actually revolutionized lending, payment and all that within that country. So I think I see that, coming into in the next couple of years to ensure that we have, access to affordable and frictionless payment services. Yeah.
So collaboration, solutions that already exist, PAP, you're talking about BVN in Nigeria. Anything else to add, looking ahead on P2P payments as we close?
Yeah, I think maybe just a comment on interoperability. I think interoperability is really a lot around the regulator. It's a space for the regulator, because Interoperability, you're telling all the players to think about the ecosystem first rather than themselves. So in some countries, that's an easy conversation to have because the people are just very nationalistic in their thinking. So when you think about a country like India, that's a little bit about how they think. They think country before their business. And if you think a little bit about Nigeria, the same. But the regulator is able to create a level playing field for everybody, and as it were, allow everyone to see that there is benefit in enlarging the pie rather than competing for the small share of financial services that are there in the market. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of challenges to be dealt with when it comes to interoperability, but I do believe, and we have seen use cases where when the regulator steps in to create an open and significantly enlarged ecosystem, then everybody benefits. The people who had been excluded from these services are now included, and even the players are now able to play across a larger spectrum of people, a larger spectrum of types of customers that before had been excluded from the financial services systems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Dr. Pista, you know, it's a very, I'm on the side here. It's a very interesting topic, and I'd love for us to at least even for 5 minutes open it up to the plenary. So if there are any burning questions or someone wants to shoot and say, you know, George, how do we handle A, B, C, D, or you know, Sandeep, you're coming to this market, you've been exposed to different other spaces. What are you actually seeing as the unique challenges and opportunities? So if there are any questions from the plenary, if you could just raise your hand and make your way here. I think this is one of the more critical conversations that we're having over these 2 days, and it would be great to be able to, you know, squeeze as much value as we can from this panel. So do we have any takers?
Especially as the consumers of these solutions you're talking about. Any pain point you had and you just want to voice it for people to think about?
You know, for a bit of context, I mean, if you go out in Nigeria and I need to send Harry some money, I'll walk out onto the street, flip out my bank card, plonk it into a point of sale system, and that's how I move money. That's how I get to pay. But in Kenya, you know, you can't even imagine that sort of user experience. So we are seeing a lot of, speaking into the fragmentation, we are seeing a lot of that happening across markets, and the challenge remains, how do we even from a user experience perspective change it? If my brother flies in from West Africa and comes into Kenya and he's trying to look for all these agents on the streets and he can't find, what are the fallback mechanisms that we're having to allow, literally, if you're to make our borders porous for trade and commerce, what are some of the things that we are actively doing towards, you know, bridging that gap? And anyone could take that question.
You want to try?
Maybe I can go first. Okay. So I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all across all the countries. So if you look at the scenario we just played out now, I mean, I remember the first time I got to Kenya for like 1 year, I didn't use M-Pesa. My former boss was asking me why. I said it's too expensive for me. Not that I can't afford, but when I look at from where I'm coming from, and I did the conversion rate, what is going to cost me to send 1,000 shillings to George? It's going to cost me like, and I send the equivalent of that in Nigeria. I'm paying like 10x or 15x of the transaction cost. So I think if you look at various dynamics and payment trails that exist across different countries and the interventions of various stakeholders and the regulators, I think one thing that comes out clear is different countries will have different implementations, we have different payment trails, we have different factors that can actually foster different payment services. But if you now look at regulators that are playing or players that are playing within the regional space, like we are seeing for Afrexim, AFTA and all that, it's going to be a separate conversation to now harmonize all those fragmented maybe user experiences or probably frameworks or standards that exist across different countries and unify it from a regional perspective. So it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. It will still continue that way to a greater extent. But of course, we are seeing the trend towards unification of various user experience across different countries.
Thank you. Do you have any takers, any more questions, or shall I shoot one last one before we wrap up this panel? Any takers? Maybe one last one from me then. Let's explore the area of the business side of it. We've seen, players like MoneyPoint just raised a ton of cash as well, looking to expand. We talked about different spaces and regulatory regimes. What do you think are the main challenges of any player outside regulation and outside government? What should they brace themselves for if they are looking at, the Pan-African opportunity?
Do you want to?
Definitely any fintech, any financial organization, the first thing, Africa is not one country, right? Different regulatory regimes, so that's definitely the basis, right? You need to understand the regulatory landscape and adapt to it. So that's definitely the first challenge, and if you solve for it, right, then the journey becomes a lot easier because you understand what the local dynamic is. And secondly, if you look at most of the African countries, we are operating in 3 African countries: South Africa, Kenya, and Mauritius. Stark difference between all 3 countries, right? If you look at Kenya is the basis of PSPs is what? It's mobile, right? The mobile phone, right? And Kenya is a place where genesis of mobile money literally happened, right? Kenya showed the world that this is how things happened, right? On the base of that, a lot of countries replicated models, a lot of companies replicated the model, and now regulators are talking about, that definitely this is the way forward. This is the underlying principle is financial inclusion. That's what, we are creating. We are creating accessibility. We are ensuring, everybody is connected to a financial institution in some way or the other. We are heading towards a cashless economy or society, and we look at South Africa now with PayShap, following a similar sort of a model, but they are starting on a different note, that it's a level playing field for everybody. Mauritius created something called as MOCAS, which is the instant payment switch. So the dynamic of each country is very different, right? And what is important for any fintech or any organization is to localize, to understand what the local challenges are and how we can customize, or one can customize to, what is the problem at hand in that particular region and how to solve for it. So beyond regulation, it is about understanding the local reality and localize your solution to that particular market, right? And on top of it, definitely, if you're present in multiple countries, you can leverage from your presence and do a lot more basis the experience that each country has to offer.
Thanks, Sandeep. Topista, take us home.
Great. So just to close, we are all hearing your customer pain points to be shared with the service providers, regulator to help bring the fragmented industry service providers, steer them towards providing the solutions, and collaboration in actually making this happen. So thank you very much. Let's keep talking offline from here. Thank you.